Hello, this is Naveen Somani here, and I will be giving a third speech for the Team USA debate application. Before I get into this speech, I'd like to list out a few common arguments that I believe would have been made in the first and second speech. I will be taking side opposition in this speech. So let's start off with the assumed proposition arguments. First, I assume they would say, political knowledge tests create a more informed electorate that elects better leaders and produces better governance. Second, that voting should require a minimum level of political knowledge because uninformed voters could undermine or destroy a democracy. And third, that governments can fairly implement political knowledge tests to improve the quality of their elections. And to clash with these points, I offer the following three arguments from the opposition side that I assume would have been made in the first and second speech. First, that voting exists to provide representation, not to reward political competence and segregate informed versus uninformed voters. Second, that the real threat to democracy is misinformation and manipulation, not uninformed voters. And third, that political general knowledge tests are able to be manipulated, and giving governments that ability to decide who or who doesn't vote is always unjust. With that, I will get into the speech on my first word. The proposition is asked a very simple question. Should people understand politics before they vote? And the answer is obviously yes. We're not disagreeing, but unfortunately, that is not the motion today. The question before us asks if governments should have the power to decide which citizens are knowledgeable and which are not allowed to participate in democracy. And that is fundamentally unjust. In this speech, I will cover two main areas. First, a few notes to clarify the framing, and then address the three main clashes of this round, with weighing and comparative analysis throughout each point. So let's start off on the framing, where proposition fundamentally misunderstands the purpose and burdens for today's motion. First, it's not about whether informed voters are good or not. Remember, we place the burden on the proposition that they need to prove specifically why the political general knowledge test is the only and best way to get to these informed voters. Panel, the proposition proving in today's debate that informed voters are good or better for a democracy is not enough for their side to win. They need to specifically prove that to achieve that point, we need political general knowledge tests. And when we have showed numerous times that they are not accurate and don't let you get to that point, it is simply not enough for them to win this round. But on our second burden, they concede that the strongest voting countries with elections are often democracies, and a key democratic process is having fair and equal representation. Thus, the proposition must fundamentally contest why democracies specifically ought not to uphold what literally makes them unique and distinct and a key part of their process. It's a prerequisite argument before they could even join the debate. But let's start off on the first clash of today's round about what voting is actually for. Look, proposition in their last speech tells you, we need to make sure that all voters are informed to have better outcomes for the future. But this is fundamentally flawed for one main reason. Taking proposition on their highest ground, they never answer the question of who deserves a vote. The argument we've given you since the first and second speech is that the entire point of voting, fairness, and democracies is to give everyone a say. Even if we believe proposition's argument at the highest level and they can somehow magically sort perfectly between informed versus uninformed voters, that is not what the definition of voting and fair elections are. It is not picking or choosing whoever you want to participate, because that is completely contradictory to everything that voting and representation stands for. The reason why the factory worker deserves a vote is not because they can explain the structures of the government or know everything happening in the political process, but because those government decisions directly impact their wages and their family. And this is why the proposition's logic goes out the window here. They allow the people most affected by policies to lose political representation because they aren't categorized as, quote, informed voters. In any world, in any country, in any political system, that is fundamentally unjust. That's why when we challenged proposition to bring up an example of any democracy that respects elections, that has this political general knowledge test, they are unable to do so because it is simply not a part of a fair voting process. But let's go on to the second clash of today's round on disinformation. Look, proposition in their last speech tells you that the root cause of having bad governments and electing leaders is that citizens don't have the right information. They don't spend enough time doing research. They aren't informed. But what we've told you is that's simply not the root cause. Throughout the debate, they will tell you that the voting system is failing, the wrong people are elected, is because the public doesn't spend enough time researching. But that is not the root cause. It is because politicians, media actors, and institutions intentionally manipulate voter information to influence opinions and skew information. This is literal propaganda being pushed by these governments to sway voter information. Meaning, this is very important for one key reason, that even if you side your ballot for signed proposition, they have no solvency to their own issues in today's round. Because no matter how many political knowledge tests you try to push on your people, you can never stop disinformation and propaganda from turning these informed into uninformed voters. Overall, proposing is not going to solve for any of their harms, because we've given you numerous examples from the Chinese disinformation campaigns that sway Taiwanese voters, showing that no matter how many political knowledge tests you put onto your people, when false information is created by media and governments, there is no way to distinguish between informed versus uninformed voters. And by having these tests, you either segregate all of them into not being able to vote, or two, you're unable to classify them properly. Thus, at the end of the day, comparing the two worlds, proposition cannot solve for their own issues. But let's go into the third and final clash of today's debate, about whether restricting political participation actually creates a better governance. Looking past just the philosophical justifications, we need to look into the real-world implementations, because it is a "this house would" policy, and we have shown numerous times why this test will only lead to failure. As the comparative burden, their world requires that governments are the ones who decide. It is not a general test written by anyone. The governments are crafting these. And then proposition tells you that, by filtering out less informed voters, we create a smarter system to elect better leaders. But this misunderstands what actually happens when you implement a test. They tell you that implementing these will always accurately separate informed versus non-informed voters. But they never tell you the information behind this. Who writes these tests? Who decides the passing score? Who decides what knowledge is enough? It is always the government. And throughout history, when you entrust the government to make these decisions about who should participate and who shouldn't, it always dramatically fails. That's why we gave you the example in our last speech that when conceded that for decades in the US, literacy tests were justified with the logic identical to the propositions that were meant to increase voter participation and make sure more knowledge for people to improve governments. Instead, these literacy tests were used to exclude African Americans from the political process. They argued that it was just ensuring voters were informed, when in reality, whenever presidents don't want a certain group to participate, they tailor these tests with impossible standards to make sure groups fail. Overall, looking at the two worlds and weighing, the proposition creates a mechanism that future governments can and will manipulate to frame out minorities and exclude groups from participating. This is a complete turn on all of their impacts, because by secting out these groups, it overall decreases the democratic process and harms the political process in the long run, as these wealthy aristocrats and leaders will hold power and exclude whatever makes a democracy. Ultimately, proposition asks you to trust governments with the power to decide who deserves a voice, who deserves a vote, and who can make up democracy. But history teaches us that this trust is misplaced, because the moment governments gain the ability to choose who can participate and who can't, they gain the ability to shape the electorate itself. And once that happens, the greatest threat to democracy is no longer an uninformed voter. It is a government that decides who counts and who doesn't. Because that is fundamentally unjust, I am extremely proud to stand on side opposition today.